And welcome to another AskOkey podcast, coming to you from Studio One. Pete here, the host, and my guest, the prof, a familiar face to you all. This evening, we're talking about suits of different kinds, pants and the history of pants. We might get onto the subject of black suits. There's been some furore about that.
Acrimony.
Acrimony out there in the electronic universe. And once again, welcome to you all, our loyal and, of course, very well-beloved audience in cyberspace. So without further ado, let's get started. Prof looks this evening as if he's getting ready for an interview. Are you? Have you applied for a job, Prof?
Well, actually, I thought you were going to say I look like a city lawyer.
Well, you might, if you're going to be applying for a job in a law firm.
I look more like, I would think sort of this, you would have mistaken me for a partner at a law firm.
Well, possibly. I don't know any.
As opposed to an underling or sort of a job seeker. No, Pete, of course not. I'm not on my way to an interview. Neither am I awaiting an announcement of being made a partner.
Made a partner,
firm.
yeah.
But this reminds me of what in the old days lawyers and bankers would wear.
And of course,
partners.
You were a banker.
Exactly. So especially partners at law firms and investment banks.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a charcoal. It's a chalk stripe, but not only is it a chalk stripe, but you can see that the chalks vary in width.
They do.
So it's not sort of it's not a uniform chalk.
No, it's not.
It's what you would call I guess an uneven chalk.
Is that a tram?
It is. I mean, it's
a tram stripe.
It's sort of they're stripes, but of different densities.
Yes.
Which makes it quite unique and sets it apart from a regular chalk stripe. But back to history, this is something that you might have seen in those oak paneled boardrooms at law firms and investment banks, because it's especially worn as a three-piece suit.
Yes,
as you know.
Yes.
It's dark, it's charcoal, and the underlings, not even middlings, won't wear this. So this is something that was probably reserved for the upper echelon, if I'm saying it correctly.
Yes.
So that's sort of the history of, chalk stripes, as you know, as traditional as they are, as classic as they are.
Yes, I mean, I don't know any bankers, I don't think, or at least the people that I know in banks certainly don't wear three-piece chalk-striped suits with tram stripes on them. And you'll notice the restrained and very traditional spotted tie as well, the white pocket handkerchief. So that's the full rig, suited and booted, as they used to say. And you don't obviously have to be a bank partner or a lawyer in a city firm to wear one of these. If you weren't such a person, where would you wear a suit like that? Because it really is a very handsome suit.
It's a handsome suit, but it conveys gravitas. It's a power suit.
A serious suit,
It's a power suit. It's not. It's not by any means what you might call a fun suit. You communicate power. You communicate presence. You communicate business.
Indeed.
I'm here. How can I say this? You're not saying notice me, but you walk into a room, your presence will be felt.
Right.
Especially if it's worn the proper way. Black shoes, just keep things as monochromatic as possible.
Yes.
So very little use of color. It's a very somber, very somber outfit, but powerful.
Yes, it is. Yes.
It's very powerful in its somberness. So I would wear this to, if you weren't a business meeting per se, maybe an evening event with some degree of import.
Like a business group meeting.
A business group meeting, or like your business club, or let's say you belong to some kind of a private club. Could be for an evening get together, gentlemen having a steak dinner. or whiskey, cigars, what have you. It's sort of something you would wear to sort of I don't want to come across as you know, what's the, who believes men are higher than women?
A chauvinist. A male chauvinist?
Chauvinist.
Right. Ah, okay.
Misogynist.
Yes. A misogynist. Okay.
Exactly.
No, I think a misogynist is somebody who hates women.
Okay.
I think a chauvinist is somebody who thinks that men are better than women. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So they both always sort of escape me, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. But you get what I mean.
I do indeed.
I don't mean to come across as a chauvinist, but sort of in a man's type of environment.
You can smell the testosterone.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
This is, you walk in and you don't say much, but then people know you're there.
And of course, there's a risk that you might be upstaged by your clothes, as they say. So you've got to have something there behind it, as it were. Otherwise,
you would hope.
Yes.
You would hope that in such a setting, you're dealing with people of substance.
Yeah. And it's made of fox flannel, I think, isn't it?
That is correct.
Yes.
So this is from, Fox's directors, or their usual limited edition cloth that they release every now and then. And we've talked about this on a number of occasions. I like Fox because they are very expressive and creative in design. So say, for instance, I mean, this is a classic pattern, right? But you don't see it very often with the standard commercial males.
No, because the stripes would be all the same.
Exactly. Yes. You see chalk stripes everywhere. Everyone makes chalk stripes, right? All the males do. But, Fox has this habit or practice of looking back in history and recreating some of these very classic patterns that are not ubiquitous or readily available elsewhere. But they make them in limited numbers. So usually if you don't get it, if you don't get it while it's hot, you might have to wait another few years until a remake.
Well, they claim that they go down into the basement of the cellar of the building, and they find old drafts, old patterns, and or old books. And Dugdale also has some patterns that they say that go back to the 50s or even earlier. Fox had a very nice, in fact, you've got one, similar gray, but with a red stripe.
Correct.
And I think
the Cary Grant flag.
Yeah. Now, here's the question. If the white or the light gray stripe and the dark gray ground bespeaks banking and law, then what does one do with the red stripe or the maroon-colored stripe?
Yes, it was sort of a lighter gray, like a medium gray.
Yeah, slightly lighter. Yes.
So this is a charcoal.
Right.
That was a medium gray with burgundy.
Yep.
Burgundy
dark
stripes,
red stripes,
in a herringbone.
That's right.
Pattern.
Yep.
Beautiful cloth, and they called it the Cary Grant. Flannel, or the Cary Grant stripe, or sort of chalk stripe or pinstripe. And certainly, if Cary Grant wore it, then it was certainly something a bit more artful.
Right.
Because he was obviously an actor, as opposed to a banker or lawyer. So something like that, obviously, still very classic, still very tasteful, but probably one to an event, or for something with a bit more air of playfulness to it.
So in other words, if you're not in that sort of business, you probably don't need something as quite as severe or as impressive as this one. I notice you like your waistcoat cut quite high, isn't it?
Yes.
As opposed to the sort of lower one.
Yes, and classically, this is the way it was done. And in my own view, I mean, now you have this waistcoats that are cut very low.
That's right.
And shows a lot of tie and a lot of
shirt.
Some of them even have 4 or 5 buttons, right? Especially Italians.
Yes.
Especially Italians, they cut their waistcoats lower and sort of usually with 4 buttons or 5 buttons. But your typical classic English waistcoat is a 6-button coat, and it's cut very high. And one, certainly, the reason it's cut very high is for added warmth.
Right, yes.
Which is
yes.
the whole point of wearing a waistcoat
yes,
is
yes.
you use it for added warmth in
Yes.
the winter if you decide to forego a coat.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. yes.
So obviously the more fabric you have, the warmer it keeps you. So that's why they cut it very high. But I personally think it looks really good. And when I was designing our waistcoats, I took this into account. A lot of people ask me in the comment section, well, Prof, why do you wear your tie like this? Why do you puff it out like this?
Right, yes, yes.
And
yes.
And I laugh, but it's something that it's a small detail,
right.
But it's something that I also incorporated into our double-breasted jacket.
Right. Yes.
So if you notice our double-breasted jackets, the crossover is pretty high.
It is. It is.
So the lapels are, as you know, quite expressive.
Yep.
But more importantly, crossover is cut very high. And the reason is that it allows you to pop your tie up. And then the lapel, in the case of the double-breasted coat or the waistcoat here, the case of the waistcoat, it holds it in place.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
So that way, even if you move around, the tie doesn't fall down.
Sure, sure.
So it acts almost as a tie clip.
Yes, yes.
So, you remember how back in the day, people would use tie clips to sort of hold their tie up? Or to sort of give it that little puff?
Yep.
With either
that little
with a
curve.
tie pin.
Yeah, a little
exactly.
curve.
They would do it either with a tie pin or with a tie clip. So with this, you don't need a tie pin or a
no,
tie
no, you don't.
So the waistcoat does that job of holding. So, I mean, you can also wear the tie flat if you wish.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But I think that wearing your tie in three, I call it where, it gives this three-dimensional
look. Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's just more artful.
Well,
yes, because
you're
everything
right.
else, think about it, you have the, curves of the lapel, you have a lot of curving parts. So, when you have a tie that lays flat, it almost feels dead.
Oh, indeed. It is dead.
So having your tie, kind of bringing it out, and for those of you who be asking me on the comment section, Prof, why do you wear your tie like this? It just sort of makes the look a bit more dynamic.
Of course.
It gives tie a life.
And you actually can't do that with a tie clip. It looks awfully silly if you do it with a tie clip. You really have to have a waistcoat. Or if you're wearing a V-neck pullover.
Exactly.
A sleeveless pullover, you could get the same effect.
Like a cricket
Yeah,
sweater.
you could get the same effect. But you actually can't do it. And I know this because I used to wear tie clips. And you actually can't do it with a tie clip. Now, I was watching something. There's a lady on YouTube. I cannot remember her name, but I'll find it out for our next episode. And she was talking about sort of the history of shirts and jackets and so forth. And her point was that the whole reason for wearing a shirt was to keep your jacket away from your skin. Because in those days, they didn't have dry cleaning. And if you wore your jacket next to your skin, it got all sweaty and dirty. So the only reason for the shirt was to separate the jacket and the waistcoat from the skin, because you could wash your shirt easily. But you couldn't wash, because it was made of wool, you couldn't wash your jacket. Hence the fact that in your case, for example, we really don't see the shirt at all. And in fact, in your case, it's serving its proper function, which is entirely as a foundation garment. In fact, not as a sort of fashion piece, fashion statement on its own. It's a foundation garment. So you can play with the collar a bit, you can play with the cuffs, you can do a little bit with designing there. But ultimately, it's only there to keep the suit away.
But it is technically underwear.
In fact, that's exactly what it is. A shirt is underwear, and that gets me to a point which I was in my mind, which is about people who wear shirts and sort of nothing else. But we'll come to that another time. Now, on
like wearing your tidy whities.
Yes, exactly.
Walking around in your tidy whities.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Now, I just got a note here on my cheat sheet about the famous black suit.
Oh.
And you made a recording the other day, and you told the world, or such as of the world that watches us, you told the world really that black suits were not the sort of thing that you should have. And quite a number of well-known social media personalities say that, yes, you should always start with a black suit. Now, this is interesting. Why not? And then why? Why do you think they like it? And why do I want to know why you don't.
Well, by coincidence, we did. I'm not going to, talk about it, but by coincidence, we covered this subject in an informal
Indeed.
reel. But I wouldn't sort of go into that. I've been flagged by the
Right,
media
okay.
staff
Okay,
not to talk about it.
Okay.
But look, let's take a walk back into
Right.
history. Okay,
Right.
let's just a random walk back. What was business dress 100 and 200 years ago, Pete? Do you remember?
Well, I'm not quite that old, but I'll give it a shot. It was black.
Okay. Black what?
It was a black stroller, mostly,
Or
a frock coat. Yeah.
pronto. Perfect. Perfect. So business wear in the 19th century and coming into the early 20th century was a frock coat.
Mm-hmm.
The frock coat now gave way to the stroller.
Yep. Yep.
Remember?
Yep.
The frock coat kind of came from the Victorian. It was sort of a holdover in its design, was really a holdover from the Victorian era.
Well, it was worn during the Victorian era.
Exactly,
Yeah,
but it was a lot more flamboyant.
Yes,
sort
yes,
of those
yes.
coats were either made in silk or
Oh, I see.
or
Earlier than
jacquard.
that. Yes,
Earlier than
yes,
that.
by about-
right?
by
when
about-
men sort of wore those,
those
powdered
colourful
wigs
things.
and
Well,
colorful things.
I think you'd find that probably black became the color of business because it was sober and
Well,
unflamboyant.
but do you know who sort of, at least who is credited with that?
Well, that would be the famous Beau Brummel.
Exactly.
But that was probably more likely a blue, a dark blue coat.
a midnight blue, which sort of has always sort of been a close substitute for black.
Well, don't
right?
don't forget that navy blue was actually black, and it turned blue because they used cheap dye. The sailors' suits were black, and they turned a sort of dark blue in the sun and the salt and everything. But navy blue was actually black at one
That's
time.
an interesting fact.
And I think what you'll find is another thing that had an influence on black was the prevalence of Baptists and Presbyterians who eschewed, there's a word, who really frowned upon flamboyance.
Right.
And so if you were doing business with Ebenezer Scrooge or somebody like that, you wanted a man who was serious. Right. And how more serious can you get than
a black suit?
A very severe black frock coat and later a stroller.
Absolutely. So going back to your initial question, so it started with the coming out of the Edwardian or Victorian era. Frock coats were a holdover, right? But those frock coats, like I said, were a lot more colorful.
Yes.
So once, the Beau Brummels of the world sort of took stage and somehow got the message of monochrome and soberness in color, then men wore black coats.
Yes.
But cut in the same frock pattern,
yes,
right?
Of course, yes.
But now they were just black coats and they were paired usually with odd trousers.
Yep. Striped trousers.
Typically striped trousers, cashmere stripe, or even checks.
Small
checks, or you've seen those images.
Yes.
Small check trousers,
absolutely.
or houndstooth.
Yep.
All sorts of fabric. So that was your business wear of the day in the 19th century, coming into the early 20th century.
Yes.
And Pete, by let's say the second or third decade of the 20th century, that was only when lounge suits.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, sort of what you now call, what you and I are both wearing, right?
In fact, we're wearing lounge
casual
suits.
dress.
Yes.
They were casual
Exactly,
suits that were worn at home.
Yes.
So men wore frock coats
and
later strollers to the office.
Yes.
If you looked at bank managers, even up to recent times, right?
Yes.
They wore strollers in black.
That's right.
So what happened was, as men moved more and more towards the lounge suit as a business suit, again, they took the color with them.
Yeah.
They took the color black with them, and then remember, men only owned one suit, like a black frock coat. That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
There were no grays, there were no midnights. It was just every man, you could have a wardrobe full of 10, 20 frock coats, right? And they were all black.
Yes.
So I think that's sort of where this idea of the black suit,
Mm-hmm.
the black business suit
Yeah, okay.
came from.
Makes sense.
And somehow people just never really departed from that. But, you were taking that and sort of placing it on a garment which really was casual wear.
Which is a lounge suit, which actually is for lounging in.
Exactly. And of course, which shouldn't be black.
No.
Right?
No.
The only black lounge suit was either a dinner suit, which was worn exclusively at night.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, anything, say in this early 20th century, all outside of your frock coat and your stroller, all lounge suits were in every color other than black.
That's right. They were. Yes.
You understand what I mean? So they were in any color.
Because they were casual.
They were casual.
They weren't a uniform.
Exactly. It was anything but black. The only black lounge suit, quote unquote, were dinner suits.
Yeah, and I remember in the early 70s in London seeing men going from Waterloo on that special underground tube line that runs to the city from Waterloo, and they were all wearing black jackets. Bowler hats. This was about 50 years ago. Bowler hats, black jackets, stiff collars. Yeah, I didn't...
Striped trousers.
I can't say I looked at their trousers, but stiff collars. Separate collars that you put on. And that kind of, by the 80s had gone. So that decade it had all gone, and they'd retired. But the interesting thing is that when men stopped wearing frock coats to work, who started wearing them and who started wearing strollers was servants. And you can in fact see how the servants wear what the men used to wear. And so that's where you can still probably see a stroller. If you go to a hotel like Claridge's or the Ritz or somewhere, you could probably see somebody. Again, in the 70s, I remember the men who worked, the managers who worked in Claridge's all wore equivalent of morning dress. So it survived in some areas. Waiters in very fancy restaurants wore morning dress, and it survived there. But that's interesting. So the black suit is a sort of carryover from that. And I suppose, in a sense, people think, well, it's neutral. It looks very severe. Perhaps they think it looks quite smart. I mean, you could wear one to a funeral. Undertakers wear them, obviously. So black has a sense of being appropriate at funerals.
It has a sense of occasion.
It certainly has a sense of occasion.
Communicates a sense of occasion.
So if you're not going to wear a black suit, what would be the next best thing? Would be sort of like a charcoal gray.
So
my
point, and sort of there's only so much you can cover in a 60-second reel. So I mean, there were a lot of complaints. Oh well, you didn't give us a good reason. You didn't tell us. You didn't give us a thesis.
Right. Yes.
You didn't give us a thesis. You just told us not to wear it. This is not helpful. Well, there's only so much you can say in 60 seconds.
Yes,
but the point is this, Pete. I'm not saying don't own a black suit. If you have the luxury of a broad wardrobe, and let's say you own 20 suits, of course a black suit could be one of them.
Yes.
And that one suit could be reserved for funerals. Right? I can't think of anything else where they would be suitable, right? But then how many funerals do you attend in a year?
Well, when you get to my age, probably quite a few. But yes, I know what you mean.
But you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do
For the
exactly
average
know what
person,
you mean.
right?
Well, it's like a dinner jacket.
So how many funerals do you? So let us assume that you're investing, like your suits. Well, people have different price points. But let's assume sort of someone is a serious connoisseur, right? And you had to make a decision. Do I get a bespoke black suit? Now, that's a serious consideration.
Of course it is. Yeah.
Right? So do I spend £5,000, £6,000 on a black suit to commission a black suit that I might wear once a year?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. So I'm not talking about a cheap black suit that costs, $100 that is entirely disposable. Talking of a proper suit.
Sure.
Now, if you follow the same logic and said, if you got a charcoal suit,
yeah, you get a lot of wear out of it.
You get a lot more use out of it. Okay? Get a charcoal suit, a dark charcoal suit, of course, without chalks, without stripes like this. either a charcoal suit or a midnight suit. Midnight blue, right?
Yeah, so that's the thing, isn't it? Midnight is almost there.
Is almost there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, yes.
So with a charcoal suit, on midnight, they're somber enough.
Yeah.
They're somber enough to sort of communicate that same sense of occasion.
Of course, yes.
While being more practical.
While being more practical, yes.
So that was what I meant to, if I had a lot more time, of course, I would have, been able to express all of this in the reel, but like I said, you only have 60 seconds. So once again, traditionally, black suits have been reserved for dinner suits or sort of, something to be worn at night. It's not a day suit.
No.
Traditionally, it's just not a day suit. It's not something you wear for business during the day or to any day occasion. The only exception to that rule might be a funeral.
Yes.
Right? To communicate that funereal air,
mood,
so
yes, or air.
But there then again, like we both agree, how many funerals do you attend?
Hopefully,
if you're an undertaker, or if that's your business, or if you're a funeral director or clergy, right? A clergy, for instance, you might have to officiate at funerals, every week.
Well, and they wear black suits regularly.
They wear black suits. So for those professions, right, it's justified. But for everyone else, really, you really have no need for a black suit in your wardrobe.
Indeed.
Make sense?
It does. Thank you for that. Yes, I think we've written the book on black suits, definitely. And of course, if you are of the Woody Allen structure and you want to feel as though you're John Cena, you need a charcoal gray chalk stripe suit with a high-cut waistcoat. Believe me, cars will stop as you walk in front of them.
And ladies too.
And ladies too, hopefully. So we've talked about the history of black, as it were, with reference to suits. Another topic that I think is quite fascinating is the history of pants. Now, if you look around the world, there are places where men don't wear trousers. Arabia is one. If you look on the internet or television, parts of Africa, parts of India, so forth. And it's curious that trousers is sort of a Northern European thing that has become kind of universal. Now, I wonder why. Because they're harder to make than just making a sort of dress or a robe. They require more workmanship. They're probably more, I've never worn anything but them, but they're probably more uncomfortable. And yet they became the standard. Now, I wonder why that is. Have you ever thought about that?
Well, in the same vein, you might also ask the question, why has the suit become the standard?
Well, the suit became the standard because suit meant ensemble, like the French, the word suite meaning a group of rooms, right? So a suit is just a corruption of the word suite, which is a collection of things.
Now, the question then begs, Pete, what came first, the coat or the trousers?
Well, the idea...
Or did they come together?
Well, the idea, obviously, I mean, there's a simple fact of the anatomy. So you've got two arms, so you're going to have something that ends up looking sort of like a jacket, but not necessarily, because it could be a sort of cape.
A cape.
You see. You could have a sleeveless one, and provided it's not too cold, that would suit you. But it's interesting that the jacket and the pants in all weathers, and nowadays in all climates, in all parts of the world. Now, before the Americans landed in Japan, Admiral Perry sailing into Tokyo Harbor there, I think, the Japanese wore extraordinary, interesting sort of clothes and national dress, as it were. Within about 10 years, they'd put on morning coats and striped trousers and they bowler hats. And they've been wearing them ever since. The jacket, the kind of jacket that you and I are wearing, this is very interesting because what it is, it's a riding jacket, if you think about it. It's an equestrian coat.
Mm-hmm.
And why do I say that? Because it has a vent at the back,
Mm-hmm.
and so you can literally leap on your horse
Mm-hmm.
wearing your jacket. And it's unbuttoned at the front, or
Mm-hmm.
can be buttoned, but it doesn't have to be. So when you're riding your horse, it's all convenient. Now, that means that the suit, the jacket of the suit, originally was a working garment. It wasn't to be worn for decorative purposes
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of lace or embroidery, which you wouldn't want to wear when you're riding a horse.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a working garment, and I guess trousers were working garments. And I can imagine peasants in the field wearing trousers while the lords in the castle were wearing long flowing robes of silk, if you see what I mean.
Well, look, Pete, let's take a step back here. And we've talked about this before. I think this came up in a prior podcast. The history of classic clothing, as we know it today, is in the regiment.
That's also true. But but that's where you get the riding jacket from.
Exactly. So the point is that even in the regiment, and so basically it was largely a European invention. Let's call it what it is.
Yes.
So I'm not sure where, what particular century or what millennia, where regiments now sort of developed a code of dress. I would reckon this was pre-Napoleon, it was pre-Napoleonic wars.
I can tell you, in the case of England, it was Cromwell's New Model Army in about 1640.
Exactly. So about the 1500s, 1600s. That was really when, and obviously trousers are more suited, say for instance, for riding.
True.
Okay.
True.
So
absolutely.
back then there were cavalries.
Yep. That is also true.
So all armies were sort of, especially the officers, rode on horses.
Yes.
So the officers who were really the tailored clothing were made for them, right? So if you think about what did the typical officer do, he rode on horseback.
Rode on a horse.
So trousers were practical because you had to sit astride. You couldn't sit astride in
a skirt.
In a skirt or sort of in a kilt.
No.
Right? Otherwise, all hell would be let loose, right?
Yeah, that's right.
The enemy will see
your
weak spot, as it were. So, as a cavalry officer, you sat across a horse. So it made sense that whatever you wore had to have two legs and sort of be cut deep enough in the middle. Now, I'm just sort of scientifically deducing. I'm not saying
no. I think
there is no history
right.
behind this. You asked me a question, and I'm just sort of trying to walk my way back.
Well, I think it may have started with breeches, you see. And then they got longer.
That's my point. But breeches are trousers. Right? Breeches are trousers. The point being that why do why do trousers come with two legs? Right? Because you have to sit on either side of the horse. And you had to have your legs covered.
That's right.
That wouldn't happen with a skirt.
No,
or
indeed.
With some kind of a gown or with a wrapper or whatever it is.
That's right.
They were in India, in Africa, or here in Arabia, right? You couldn't ride a horse with a kandora, for instance.
Very difficult, yes.
So I think if you ask me logically, from sort of deductive reasoning, to me that would be the genesis of the trouser.
Yeah,
right?
I think
and of
in
course
its modern sense. Of
course, the coat followed. Like you said, officers rode on horses, so the center vent, for instance, all coats back then. Remember, before the modern coats were longer. Like the military coats, they were longer, but they still had a center vent.
Of course.
So they were cut closer to the body. They were worn without a shirt inside. They were these almost like tunics, right?
Well, yes. Now this is another interesting thing, because in the Napoleonic Wars, the long grey trousers were actually called overalls, like, dungarees. And they were for soldiers on the march. And presumably they wore some other pants underneath. And these were the greys, and they had a strap that went round under your foot, so they didn't flop around. But I think that the interesting thing here is that, in fact, what we can say is the lounge suit is ultimately derived from a military uniform.
Absolutely.
And it goes back, I think you'd probably find in its modern form, to about 1880, I would think, 1870, 1880. And it's interesting that if you look at illustrations, it hasn't changed that much.
No.
Really.
After breeches,
okay, well,
skinny trousers, you could argue, are an attempt.
Yeah, and maybe an attempt, yes, to resuscitate riding breeches, yes.
Drain pipe trousers, you
Jodhpurs, yes.
You could argue as a very, let's say, timid attempt.
A timid attempt,
yes. Timid attempt at riding breeches, or sort of the breeches they used to wear in the Victorian era. But besides that, you're right. I mean, really, the form hasn't really changed much.
No, it hasn't.
In 200 years.
No, and of course, I mean, there are limited modifications you can make, and no doubt advances and changes in construction, but really...
You can't add a third leg to the trousers.
No, this is the point, or a third arm. I mean, so you're limited in that sense, but as I said, the broadcast that I was watching, she was talking about how clothes sort of became to be built up, and the point was that men's clothes don't have to be built up as much as ladies' clothes, because you've got the shoulders and you've got the muscle and so forth underneath it. But it's just curious when you look at it that the standard lounge suit is ultimately derived from a military uniform or from horsemanship. And the other interesting thing is that they all look the same. Now, if you look at photographs from, well, within living memory even, you'll notice that German clothes were cut slightly differently. French, you could almost tell from just looking at the clothes. For example, German hats had a different shape to the brim. Mm-hmm. The jackets had a different shape of lapel. In Eastern Europe, they had very, very sort of scooped lapels. Mm-hmm. All of that's gone now. And so now we've got a sort of universal uniformity, which is interesting. Now, next thing I wanted to ask you about, hats. Has the hat died? Has the hat disappeared, do you think? Except for a very few sort of collectors or fans or aficionados of the hat.
Well, I don't think it's coming back in the sense that it used to be part of a man's uniform.
Right.
And you have to ask yourself, where did the hat itself come from?
Good question.
Well, we just answered that question. It came from the military.
Well, a cap would have done.
Well, but headgear. Let's just say headgear.
Headgear, yeah.
Right.
Yep,
so a hat is, sort of is headgear. So if we agree, right? If we hold down as a constant that classic dress itself, tailoring, comes from the regiment, then it makes sense.
Yes.
That part of clothing or part of tailoring had to include some form of headgear.
Yeah, indeed.
So, of course, a gentleman can wear a helmet, right? Because that's protective. Yeah. That's protective gear to be worn, to be worn in the battlefield. But something had to cover the head.
Yes.
And I think that's sort of how hats came about. And obviously, different sort of hats. That's we're not going to go into that.
Well, maybe head warmth, because the head loses a lot of heat very easily.
But also in the military, right? The reason they wore hat was for protection. Well, protection against sort of
the elements.
The elements, generally speaking. Be it enemy fire or sort of rain or what have you.
Yeah.
So the hat is a functional wardrobe piece. Always has been, and how did it go away? There are a lot of theories on this, and I've talked about this in a prior reel, so I'm not going to give much away. It's funny you're asking me all these questions that you actually asked me to talk about on the private reels.
Did I?
Yeah, because you came up with the topics, right?
Ah, right. Okay.
So you asked me to speak on a number of these things, and I've sort of spoken extensively on them. So I don't want to give I don't want to give too much away.
No, I was just wondering briefly.
But I want to say two things, right? To your question, I want to say two things. There are two events that mark the disappearance of the hat. One is the famous, or the now infamous, Kennedy inauguration in 1960.
Right, yes.
Where he wore morning dress without a hat.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And as you know, Kennedy was seen something as even sort of a style icon.
That's right, yes.
Especially with younger men back in the day. not only a style icon, but something of an iconoclast.
Sure.
And so you told me in this studio some time ago that back then there were no designers, there were no marketing companies, there were no brands. The people took their lead from what the leaders wore.
I would say maybe that might have been true a bit earlier. I'm not sure by that time, which was what, 1960 or 60, January of 61.
There was still some of it left.
For sure.
Especially if you were such an iconic figure. Like JFK, right? Yeah. So I think that singular event is credited. Now, it might be old wives' tale, and there might be some credit to it, but a lot of people credit that singular event as the moment where men decided they weren't going to wear hats.
Right.
Because they wanted to sort of, mimic JFK.
Yeah.
That's one explanation. The other explanation, of course, is that men wore hats up to the 50s, really, like into the late 50s, into the early 60s. It was basically, even coming back from the war, right?
No, I remember.
Hats were still de rigueur.
Of course.
It really started to go away in the mid-60s.
Yes.
Mid-60s going into the late 60s and early 70s. Yeah. And if you think about it, Pete, that era also coincided with the flower revolution.
True.
The rebellion. The upcomings of jeans.
Right,
the burning of bras. Civil rights. Gender rights.
Right.
All kinds of things, all kinds of social movements, right? Yeah. So there was just this general air of progressiveness,
right,
and kind of liberal. There was a liberal air that it almost sort of if it didn't necessarily stand for anything, it stood against tradition.
Well, you'll notice that Sean.
Do you understand what I mean?
I do.
So I think the hat really fell victim, right? The hat was an accidental or collateral victim to that change of guard, so to speak. And that's why it lost its appeal almost en masse and almost instantly, if you think about it. It wasn't a phased thing. No. It just sort of happened within a few years. Yeah. Men went from everyone wearing a hat to like literally everybody sort of walking, going without a hat.
And there are case studies in business schools of the efforts that hat makers associations made and the huge amount of money that they spent to try to persuade people to wear them. It's interesting this because in Dr. No and I think From Russia with Love, James Bond and Goldfinger, James Bond, Sean Connery wore hats. But then once he got to, I think, Thunderball, it was gone. And that Thunderball was, I think, 67. And that was it. So that would coincide. And of course, the people who produced the James Bond films were obviously very, very conscious of trends and styles. But he wore hats in the first couple of films, and then no more. So there you go. Interesting because it's a case of something that was so common, and now you've got obviously some. So there are people still who like them and who understand them and who wear them.
I do think that, and that's why we have to somehow respect the classics and tradition because. Think about it. These things didn't exist in a vacuum. People just didn't wake up one day and say, okay, just let's have this thing on top of our head. If you look at the human, if you look at a figure, a dress figure, especially if you've got a coat on, right? It doesn't look complete without a hat.
No, indeed. It's funny that.
Especially if you have a top coat on. There's a particular silhouette.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, it's and then obviously if you have it's less obvious with a regular jacket or but if you have a proper coat on, with wide, well, not wide, but shoulders, good shoulders and so on. The hat or sort of the brim sort of shades or
yes, it does.
Your eye goes in a straight line from the brim down through the shoulder of the coat all the way to the sweeping
absolutely
skirt. It's just a beautiful uniform
it is.
figure.
Yes.
And when you don't have a hat on, it looks incomplete.
That is actually very interesting, isn't it? Because
you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Even if you look at someone in a lounge suit, right? Especially if it's a structured coat or structured suit, right? With good structure in the shoulder and everything.
Yeah.
If you look for symmetry, a hat always sort of establishes that symmetry from top to bottom. It just looks more uniform than, let's say, someone were to go barehead.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Hatless. Yes, isn't that interesting? So in other words,
the head looks small. Think about it, right? So if you've got this structured coat, like I have on, like I like to wear mine, you've got structure, you've got sort of a drape in the chest and everything, and you're communicating, as we would say, this archetypical Greek figure, you know, presence, strength, right? And then you look up and it's just one small head on top of it. It doesn't look right. With a hat, what the hat does is that the brim, especially with a dress hat, which usually are wider brims, it balances things out and allows the eye to travel from the top all the way.
And it makes a sort of shape like that, doesn't
it?
Yes.
Exactly.
And it's curious what you just said, which is that people didn't suddenly wake up and think, I need something on my head. And obviously, hats, if you're a farmer, it serves a functional purpose. It prevents you from getting sunburnt and so forth. And a decorative purpose, the way that you've just described, and also useful purpose in terms of setting up a silhouette and setting up a structured figure. And we come back, as we quite often do, to the point about balance and the point about proportion and kind of completing the picture. There's no doubt about it that the hat does make one look completely different, actually. And obviously, if you're bald, it covers up that unfortunate state of affairs. Neither you nor I suffer in that sense. So we don't need hats for that purpose. But it'll be interesting to see if, as and when, who knows, possibly, never, as you said, to the extent that it once was, but perhaps with the efforts of people like us, hats will start to make something of a comeback. It's unfortunate that we do these podcasts indoors, because if we were outdoors, we could wear the hats. We would have an opportunity to wear the hats. I think that's one of the difficulties, is that you really can't wear them inside.
Well, I do some of my solos. Oh,
I know,
with the hat,
I know.
I mean, I get a lot of hell for it, but again, I explain that people get all bunched up in a knot about, no hat indoors, but do you understand sort of the etiquette itself is very nuanced?
Is it?
Right?
Yes.
It is very nuanced. I mean, if you really want to get very, very anal about it, a hat may be worn indoors in a public place.
Right.
Or on a public stage.
Yes.
And that includes hotel lobbies, transportation thoroughfares, like bus stations, train stations. And the only place where it is expressly verboten is in a private home.
Right.
So when you go into a private home, as a mark of respect, you must take off your hat.
Sure.
So, and I did explain this in a prior video, that what we do here, we're on a very public stage.
Right.
This would be the equivalent of Frank Sinatra being on stage.
Indeed.
Or Michael Jackson being on stage.
Right.
So do you tell Michael Jackson to take his hat off on stage?
Well,
no,
obviously not.
Because it's part of the costume.
That is true.
Same with Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin.
Although
Sammy Davis Jr.
Yeah, they never wore...
Or what's his name? The dancer. Fred Astaire.
Fred Astaire.
Right?
Although I have to say that neither Martin nor Sinatra wore hats while they were performing on stage. But there's probably, again, reasons they didn't. But they certainly wore them outside. And if they were wearing them, you're quite right. You wouldn't tell them to take them off. Anyway, fascinating, as always. Thank you, Okey. We're coming to the end of another evening. So hats, trousers, black suits, chalk-striped grey suits, if you want to make perhaps the most powerful of impressions. Thank you once again. And we look forward to seeing you all again.
Thank you.
In future. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.